I'm always reminded of George Bernard Shaw's introduction of a speaker where he came up behind the stage and this speaker, who was an acclaimed academic, said, I'm going to talk about this. How much time do I have? And he said, well, you have 5 minutes. So, well, how can I possibly say everything I know in 5 minutes? And Shaw said, speak very slowly. So what I want to do this evening is discuss innovation in the interwar Army, and my views about why the Army never developed the equivalent of a German blitzkrieg. Now, I'll conclude by trying to draw some insights from that era that I believe are really relevant to today's modernization issues. Next slide. Next slide. So the traditional interpretation of the Army's unpreparedness for World War II was that congressional penury, public malaise were responsible for the deficiencies we had in World War II. My view of these constraints were real, but the principal reasons for the Army's conceptual and modernization woes were internal, Army culture, bureaucracy, and internal air power insurgency, and their combined impact on the development of weapons and doctrine. Next slide. Clearly, other countries and indeed other services inside the United States Armed Forces innovated under similar conditions. The intellectual underpinnings of the German blitzkrieg were well in place before Hitler's rise to power during a crippling depression and international sanctions. The U.S. Navy developed carrier aviation, the Marine Corps developed amphibious operations, and the technology to realize these visions under the same conditions. The question I'll discuss tonight is why there is no interwar U.S. Army example of this type of conceptual and technological development. In short, whether the American blitzkrieg. Next slide. I want to begin with a discussion of the U.S. Army's experience in World War I. The Great War was a seminal experience for the Army, its first major war off our shores, and we took important lessons from that conflict. First, manpower and industrial mobilization were the keys to modern war, although man was still the ultimate weapon. Second, the Army believed its doctrine of open warfare was sound, even though this assessment was based on only 6 months of combat against a largely exhausted German army. Next slide. The board that made these determinations stated somewhat amazingly that, quote, the stabilized warfare that prevailed in France in 1917 was due in a great measure to the lack of aggressiveness on both sides. General Pershing, commander of the AEF, went so far as to note, quote, the fact is that our officers and men are far and away superior to the tired Europeans. There were, however, as we shall see, some in the Army who felt the future of warfare would be in the air, not on the land or sea. Finally, the American Army, like other interwar armies, was confronted with two radical technologies that they'd all observed, the tank and the airplane. Next slide. In the case of tanks, the American experience was mixed. As with most other modern armaments in the war, we relied on the British and French for almost everything we had, to include tanks. Combat experience was limited to the closing days of the war, with a brigade of light Renault tanks led in combat by General George Patton, and an American heavy tank company fighting with the British. Next slide. This slide shows the somewhat primitive state of the development of tanks in World War I, although there were actually early mission command efforts, pigeon-based information. In the Army, the view was that tanks were infantry support weapons and that they had severe limitations because they were technically unreliable and they ended up generally sticking in trenches. As one author has called them, they were rude mechanicals. Next slide. As with tanks, the vast majority of aircraft were supplied to the Americans by the British and the French. What is radically different, however, is the astonishing progress the aviation technology made during the war. From these flimsy scout aircraft like the Blériot to the Handley page in the bottom right, and you notice how large that airplane is compared to the people. Indeed, General Billy Mitchell was considering airborne drops behind German lines in the future, but the war ended before this idea could develop fully. Consequently, the discussion about the future of military aviation was much broader and more informed by combat experience. Indeed, advocates envision air power as the coming decisive weapon, not wedded to the ground battle. It was a way to leap over the stalemated slaughter of the trenches and take the war to the enemy's homeland. Others, mostly ground officers, had a more conservative view and saw it essentially as flying artillery. These differing views soon ignited a controversy that, quite frankly, is still not resolved to this day. Next slide. The post-war 1920 National Defense Act framed the institutional environment where the interwar innovation would nest itself. During hearings, the Army asked for a 500,000-man Army and universal military training. Congress, however, was in a mood to economize. In the absence of a threat after what was termed the war to end all wars, wasn't convinced the Army needed to be greatly expanded. And the conversation was occasionally heated with General Peyton March, the Chief of Staff, who many in Congress deeply resented for what they viewed as high-handedness during the war. Representative Fiorello LaGuardia, never a shy person, noted that the chief has no consideration for the desires of Congress and has all the despotic will and autocratic tendencies of Ludendorff and the military genius of the Crown Prince. He concluded when, quote, "When I was a soldier, I soldier. When I legislate, I want to legislate, and I do not want Peyton C. March to tell me what I have to legislate." The death blow, however, was administered by General Pershing, the returning hero of the AEF, who testified, quote, "I am of the opinion we can place the outside figure for the peacetime regular Army at from 275,000 to 300,000 officers and men." It was a time to return to normalcy. Consequently, Congress authorized 250,000 soldiers, which we know doesn't mean anything because they appropriated for 125,000. And that's about the number the Army stayed throughout the interwar period. For an Army focused on manpower mobilization, this decision was alarming. And throughout the interwar era, the ground Army was riveted on maintaining end strength. Corps and divisions were skeletonized with cadres to provide a mobilization base. And the Army's views, the ground Army's view about technology ranged from ambivalent, quite frankly, to hostile. By Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur in 1935 summed it up. It is easy, of course, to overemphasize the influence of machinery in war. It is man that makes war, not machines, and the human element must always remain the dominant one. The economic environment caused by the Depression only worsened the situation. The Defense Act also reorganized the Army around branches. The Tank Corps was abolished, and the Infantry branch was put in charge of tanks. Additionally, Congress established the Air Service as a branch, soon renamed the Air Corps, after squelching an attempt to set up an independent Department of Aeronautics. The Army also created combat arms branches with major generals in charge to strengthen the voice of the line in the War Department. Throughout the interwar period, the Army focused its resources on paying for manpower instead of investing in research and development. The one exception was the Army's Air Corps, where the fixation was on proving air power could be decisive and thus justify an independent Air Force. Consequently, there was a much greater affinity in the Air Arm for technology, which is supported by Congress and private industry because of its obvious utility in the civilian world. Finally, the new branches exercised their broad authority over doctrine, personnel, and material and became very parochial. Doctrinally, this is, I think, the pivotal moment in the Army's history, and then it finally made the transition from a frontier constabulary to a modern Army and started to design itself for the first time in a peacetime environment to deal with what we now call pure adversaries. Next slide. So not surprisingly, once in charge of tank development, the infantry focused on making it the ultimate infantry weapons support system. Requirements emphasized that tanks had to support advancing riflemen, and they had to work efficiently at the pace of walking infantry. They had to be governed so they wouldn't go too fast. An additional limitation was placed on the tank that really affected modernization. It was decided it couldn't weigh more than 15 tons because that was the weight the divisional pontoon bridge would hold. And the chief of engineers, with his authority for being in charge of bridges, said we're not going to design any more bridges using the ones we have. Consequently, when the infantry specified characteristics it wanted in a tank, and survivability, speed, lethality, the Ordnance Department could not build it within the 15-ton limit. Furthermore, successive chiefs of infantry and cavalry in particular were ruthless in enforcing branch orthodoxy, repressing or chasing away officers with different views of tanks. Like Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, both experienced tank officers who left tanks for better career opportunities after being chastened for an article they wrote about the independent role of tanks in the future. Indeed, after going home to the cavalry, Patton wrote articles in the Cavalry Journal extolling horse cavalry for the next 20 years and worked hard inside the branch to get more budget share for the cavalry. The tank on this slide reflects exactly what the infantry wanted: 8 machine guns, including 2 in the rear that had deflectors to bounce into the trenches, and a 37-millimeter gun to take out bunkers. Next slide. In the 1930s, Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur gave the other branches the authority to develop mechanization. The cavalry branch developed combat cars, a euphemism that was necessary because by law only the infantry could develop tanks. From this decision forward, there were 2 factions in the cavalry, one in favor of modernization and mechanization, and the other very traditional and convinced of the future value of the horse. Given the authority of the branch chiefs after the act, mechanized cavalry competed with horse cavalry for budget share and force structure. The chief of cavalry determined where his budget went, and in a zero-sum resource environment, most refused to give up horse cavalry for mechanization. As a consequence, in 1940, there was only one mechanized cavalry brigade, the 7th Cavalry Brigade at Fort Knox, and it was put there intentionally so it wouldn't be tainted by the cavalry school at Fort Riley. Nevertheless, there was a growing sense that something was changing, as seen in a quote from General George Van Hoen Moseley, the 1st Cavalry Division commander, in a note to the Chief of Cavalry. Quote, "When the cowboy down here is herding cattle in a Ford, we must realize the world has undergone a change." Next slide. Any hopes of innovation in the cavalry branch ended with the appointment of Major General John Hare as the Chief of Cavalry just before World War II. Hare would not give up a single horse to buy mechanization, and he changed the conversation inside the branch. His innovation, shown in the picture in the middle, was to put horses on tractor trailers to give them operational mobility, and he never asked the question, what would they do when they got there? His view was that, quote, "As always, cavalry's motto must remain, when better roller skates are made, cavalry horses will wear them." And in a meeting in 1942 with General Marshall, Hare argued for more horses. This after the German blitzkrieg had conquered Western Europe and was deep inside of Russia. And he was quoted as saying, "In the interests of national defense in this crisis, I urge upon you the necessity of an immediate increase in the horse cavalry." Marshall's response was to get rid of all the horses in the Army and General Hare, and reorganize the Army to end the power of the branch chiefs. And I think what's really important here, there are no villains in this story. These are good officers trying to do the right thing. Indeed, many in the cavalry branch regarded Hare as a hero, was trying to keep Marshall from making a big mistake. Next slide. Aviation's a very different story. And I'll get to that in a second. But in the interluding period, General Marshall realized that the blitzkrieg was something that had to be contended with. In 1940, he enabled the creation of the armored force from all existing infantry tank units in the 7th Cavalry Brigade. As would be expected, the chiefs of cavalry and infantry objected, and Marshall, as he was wont to do, saw a bigger goal and went ahead. The armored force, however, was a captive of the cavalry, albeit mechanized cavalry ideas. General Adna Chaffee, the former commander of the 7th Cavalry Brigade, became the first chief and demanded the organization, doctrine, and employment of the armored force should be strictly mechanized cavalry. Mechanized cavalrymen would also put in key positions in the armored force to keep away the mindset of infantry tank officers. Finally, George Patton saw that his career prospects with armor had changed and came back to the armored force. Consequently, the concept for armored divisions envisioned using tanks and long-range thrust deep into the enemy's rear where they would chew up his supply installations, communications. In short, traditional cavalry missions of exploitation and pursuit. Importantly in this concept, tanks would not have to fight other tanks, and air support was not necessary. Enemy tanks would be dealt with by General Leslie McNair's pet project, the tank destroyer. Next slide. The Army's concept for tanks drove technology. What the Army wanted was a tank with great endurance, low fuel consumption, and the ability to move great distances without breakdown. A low-velocity 75-millimeter gun was deemed sufficient since this tank would not fight other tanks. It would also ease the logistic burden because you wouldn't have to trade out barrels very often. Finally, Army regulations limited tanks to 30 tons in weight, with the understandable goal at the time of facilitating the deployment to the theaters of war. This restriction on 30 tons is in effect until late 1944. Unfortunately, as one Army ordnance specialist pointed out, quote, Hitler's tanks violated this rule. By early 1942, the Germans had begun to design and field new tanks, Panthers and Tigers, with thicker armor and more powerful guns that vastly outclassed American tanks and tank destroyers. Nevertheless, evidence from the North African campaign that the Germans had tanks that outmatched ours was ignored. Conceptual issues from North Africa, particularly the Battle of Kasserine Pass, were viewed as minor, only requiring organizational tweaks, better training, in some cases, new leadership. Next slide. The catalyst for American air power views was General Billy Mitchell, who I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with. At the end of World War I, he remarked, quote, the day has passed when armies on the ground or navies on the sea can be the arbiter of the nation's destiny in war. The main power of defense and the power of initiative against an enemy is passed to the air. In 1921, he demonstrated that unsinkable battleships could be sent to the bottom by aerial bombardment. In response to the crash of a Navy airship and the loss of 3 seaplanes, Mitchell issued a statement accusing senior leaders in the Army and Navy of incompetence, quote, almost treasonable administration of the national defense. In October 1925, court-martial charges were brought against Mitchell on the direct order of President Calvin Coolidge. Mitchell was found guilty and resigned his commission, although he continued to advocate for air power until his death in 1936. But I think his central contribution to the air power cause was not his vision, but the fact that he fundamentally transformed the limits of sanctioned behavior for Army aviators. After 40 years after the trial, General Ira Eaker, who was a captain at the time of the trial and helped Mitchell prepare his defense, recalled, quote, well, naturally, I was sympathetic with General Mitchell and formed a great admiration for his method, learned a lot from him about how to influence Congress, how to influence the public, how to draw attention to individuals and ideas and concepts. And when it was announced by the President that he would be court-martialed, the young Air Force officers of my age and rank and location, being in the air staff on the Army staff, we had a pretty tough decision to make. And as we were all told by General Patrick, Chief of the Army Air Corps, that we must be very careful or we might jeopardize our entire military careers. We realized this as well as he did. But we in council, after talking it over and deliberating carefully, thoroughly, decided we'd rather stand with Mitchell for principle and for the future of air power than to save our necks and skins. Thus, Mitchell started an air power insurgency within the Army, where aviators transferred their loyalty from the Army to the idea of air power, which could only be realized with an independent Air Force. Next slide. It's important to note, however, that the idea of an independent Air Force was not shared by the Navy or the Marine Corps. After Mitchell's battleship bombing demonstration, the Navy recognized the challenge the fleet would face and the opportunities in the coming years would mature the concept for aircraft carriers. And the Marine Corps believed aviation was an important component of the Marine Corps for close air support. Next slide. In the Navy, however, there still was the battleship tribe that was a strong constituency, as this served from the program for the November 1941 Army-Navy game shows. Proudly displaying a picture of the USS Arizona, it notes that it is significant that despite the claims of air enthusiasts, no battleship has yet been sunk by bombs. Less than a month later, the Arizona is at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Next slide. By the 1930s, the Air Corps had developed the doctrine of strategic bombing that said that air power by itself could be decisive. Essentially, a dogma developed that maintained that heavily armed bomber formations would always get through with acceptable losses by hitting and hit the vital nodes of the enemy's industrial web. Thus, they could destroy an enemy's ability to wage war and thereby end a war in his homeland and not on the battlefield. Sounds familiar? This supported the idea that independent air power can be the decisive war-winning instrument, and very little thought was given to other uses of air power because it would divert it and put it hostage to the ground force. The Army's first plan that was briefed to President Roosevelt in 1941 went so far as to claim that air power might make an invasion of Europe unnecessary if they got sufficient resources to build the air force they thought they needed. Next slide. In the 1930s, this airplane and the Norden bomb site seemed to make this vision possible. Nevertheless, there's a number of key assumptions that are baked into the concept that were never revisited until combat operations over Germany in 1942. First, bomber formations could self-protect without escort fighters. Second, enemy air defenses would not pose a significant problem at high altitudes. This was true for a time, quite frankly, in the 1930s, for the way to make an aircraft fly higher and faster was to hang more engines on it. Air defenses did not have accurate rangefinders, much less radar at this point, nor time fuses for accurate flak fire. And the 50 caliber machine guns could protect bomber formations against the fighters of the day. This all changed before the 8th Bomber Command began its bombing campaign over Europe in 1942. The focus on strategic bombing became the orthodoxy, and those with other ideas, like Claire Chennault, who said fighters could intercept bombers and not allow them through, were marginalized. Next slide. I want to now turn briefly to the wartime consequences of these decisions. Before doing it, I want to spend a moment on what the Army had to do to get ready to go to World War II after Pearl Harbor. In 1942, General Marshall used an executive order, which he could not use till war was declared, to reorganize the War Department into ground, air, and surface forces, as shown here. Next slide. The 1943 organization replaced what is shown here, where 60 or more agencies had direct access to the Chief of Staff's office by law. Next slide. General Joseph McNarney, who was Marshall's hatchet man for the organization, recalled that after the reorganization, quote, immediately 95% of the papers that came up to the General Staff ceased just like that. Marshall also forced into retirement over 500 of the most senior officers in the Army. It only had 14,500 when he became chief, an officer corps that it would expand to 900,000 in the coming years. Quite simply, the structure and many of the leaders that had nurtured the Army between the wars were, in Marshall's view, not up to the task of taking it to war. Finally, General Marshall sanctioned a strategy that called for the Army to conduct 2 wars, one in the air and one on the ground. Next chart. So the manpower mobilization, as I was talking to somebody outside earlier, that is shown on this chart is nothing in my view short of miraculous. An Army grows from barely 1 million after the first peacetime draft that passed Congress by 1 vote in 1940 to 8 million officers in the coming 3 years. Next slide. Industrial mobilization for ground and air war was equally amazing. The United States built 200,000 combat aircraft, 90,000 tanks and self-propelled artillery, 250,000 other artillery pieces, and 2.5 million military trucks. Next slide. And the U.S. shipbuilding effort far outpaced the Japanese. We built 137 aircraft carriers during the war. The Japanese built 13. Perhaps the most amazing is the story of the Liberty ship, shown on the left, of which we produced 2,700 in the war. Quite simply, the Allies, and most notably the United States, had an enormous quantitative military advantage during World War II. That advantage that I will discuss now offset shortfalls in concepts and weapons quality. Next slide. From Normandy to Berlin, the ground war was a battle of attrition. won by combined arms, particularly the use of tactical air power and artillery and superior numbers. From 6 June 1944 to 12 May 1945, General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group alone lost a staggering 3,256 medium tanks and 838 light tanks. General Eisenhower was not aware of the deficiencies of American tanks until after the Battle of the Bulge, when, as always happens, sergeants started telling the story and started what was known as the Sherman Scandal in the press. After all, why would Eisenhower know? General Patton, the premier armor commander, told the press, quote, "We got the finest tanks in the world. We just love to see the German Royal Tiger come up on the field." In reality, the 75 millimeter Sherman could not penetrate the front of a German Tiger II at any range, while a Tiger II could kill Shermans at 2,000 meters. Watch the scene in the movie Fury where a Sherman platoon bumps into a Tiger I. It's a pretty good depiction of how bad it was. Eisenhower asked two of his armor division commanders, I.D. White and Maurice Rose, for their views. And I think it's best encapsulated in a statement by a Sherman tanker named Corporal Francis Vierling. Quote, "Lack of a principal gun with sufficient penetrating ability to knock out the German opponent has cost us more tanks and skilled men to man more tanks than any failure of our crews, not to mention the heartbreak and sense of defeat I and other men have felt. To see 25 or even more of our rounds fired and ricochet off the enemy attackers, to be finally hit once and we climb and leave a burning, blackened, and now useless pile of scrap iron, it would have been a tank had it mounted a gun." Eisenhower, in response, immediately implored the War Department to field the M26 Pershing tank with a 90 millimeter gun as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the M26 only began arriving in late January, and only 20 saw combat. Importantly, the Pershing could have been available much earlier, but it was not demanded by the field, nor did it fit Army concepts for armor. At the end of the war, General Marshall recognized this reality, writing, quote, "From the summer of 1943 to the spring of 1945, the German Tiger and Panther tanks outmatched our Sherman tanks in direct combat." Next slide. The Air Force doctrine of unescorted daylight strategic bombing came to an end in October 1943 in the skies over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Even in the face of exhortations by General Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, for maximum efforts to prove the value of the Air Force way of making war. Essentially, the Germans figured out how to attack bomber formations. They used airplanes that could fly as fast as the B-17, but that carry standoff weapons like cannons, rockets, or even bombs on parachutes to attack the bomber formations with impunity from the outside the range of their 50 caliber machine guns. These were generally slow-flying aircraft who could do this because there were no American escort fighters. Next. Bomber losses became too heavy to endure. In 10 days in October, the 8th Air Force lost 164 bombers. And losses among combat crews trying to finish 25 missions and go home were nearly 70% at this time in the war. Missions into Germany were suspended until drop tanks were developed for the P-47 and the P-51, allowing escort for the duration of bomber missions. Nevertheless, the replacement training base and aircraft production eventually allowed the 8th Air Force to replace losses beyond its high rate of attrition, which became the de facto definition of acceptable losses. The idea of precision bombing also proved elusive. In the European air campaign, only 20% of all bombs landed within 1,000 feet of the aim point. In the aftermath of the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted exhaustive analyses of the air war in Germany. The survey concluded that, quote, "While the bombing campaign brought the economy which sustained the enemy's armed forces to a virtual collapse, the full effects of this collapse had not been reached before the enemy's front lines when they were overrun by Allied ground forces." But the secondary effect that was important was crucial in that it destroyed the German Luftwaffe that was trying to stop the bomber stream. And the Allies had air supremacy over Normandy, crucial to the successful D-Day landings and thereafter. Next. In Japan, area firebombing became the norm until the use of the atomic bomb against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. which seemingly made further assessments of conventional strategic bombing unnecessary. 1,000 bomber raids against cities were no longer important, now that one plane with one bomb could destroy one city. Air Force officers quickly grasped the implications of this revolution in destructive power. In the aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima, General Marshall sent a message to General Spaatz, Commanding General of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, asking him to refrain from commenting about the implications of the bomb. Marshall noted that Spaatz was, quote, being widely quoted in newspapers to the effect that our present army is not necessary for the further prosecution of the war in the Pacific and that an invasion will be unnecessary. Spaatz apologized to Marshall for any possible embarrassment he might have caused, but added that he had told the press, quote, if such a bomb had been available early in the European war, it would have shortened the war by about 6 months. Ironically, the atomic bomb fundamentally reframed the debate between air and ground officers. One of the points Marshall had specifically asked Spaatz to stop raising was, quote, that the future of armies has been decidedly curtailed. Next slide. But the costs were high. The Air Force, and every time I talk about this, you ask an audience who had the highest casualties in World War II, generally the Army, but then the Marine Corps. The Army Air Forces had the second highest killed in action rate, 54,700 dead, and over 40,000 POWs. Operational aircraft losses in Europe alone included 10,000 bombers and 8,500 fighters. Next slide. So I'm going to turn now to the question I posed at the beginning of the talk of why there was no American blitzkrieg at the beginning of World War II, even after the Army had several years to see what the Germans had accomplished. My view that the tank was captive of conservative branches who tried to adapt it to their parochial interests or worse, as in the case of the last Chief of Cavalry, who actually thwarted its development to protect horse cavalry structure. The airplane became a tool in the quest for an independent air force by insurgents bent on freeing themselves from a conservative ground army and unwilling to cede control of the air weapon in any form to ground officers. Thus, an interwar institutional approach to ground combined arms and close air support, the heart of the blitzkrieg, was never demanded or developed. I guess the bottom line is that given the environment in which the tank and the airplane were developed in the Army, it would be surprising if an American blitzkrieg had ever materialized. So I guess the next question is, how valid is a traditional interpretation of the Army's unpreparedness for World War II that blames low budgets and public malaise for the Army's deficiencies? What would the Army have done if it had been more generously funded can only be answered by speculation. Nevertheless, given the internal dynamics of the Army during this period, more resources probably would have resulted in more of the same. In short, the ground army would have bought more in strength, and the air army would have bought more bombers. Next slide. In the aftermath of the war, General Bradley's 12th Army Group convened a general board to assess the American experiences during the war in Europe. They concluded a number of things. One, there was no need for tank destroyers, and that future American tanks had to be designed to fight other tanks and survive. The general board also noted the importance of the combination of armor and air power, stating, quote, "The air armored team is a most powerful combination in the breakthrough in an exploitation. The use of this coordinated force should be habitual." The air and ground officers pictured here invented an effective but ad hoc American version of the blitzkrieg, if you will, in the field because of the necessity of defeating a competent, well-armed enemy. Americans were dying. As we face the proposition of competent foes in the future, the examples of these World War II commanders are very instructive. Next slide. Consequently, I believe World War II still has highly relevant lessons for Army modernization. There are always reasons not to change or to shape technology to prevailing concepts if a threat is not known, or if it is known, not deeply studied and understood. As the new national defense strategy emphasizes, we are now in a competition with two competent state adversaries with modern weapons, something we have not faced since World War II. In the interwar period before World War II, the Army Ground Forces and the Army Air Forces prepared for the autonomous wars they wanted to fight, and American soldiers paid a heavy price to adapt to the war they had to fight. Indeed, the last time the Army effectively modernized for a peer competitor was after Vietnam for the Soviet threat against NATO. In the 1970s and 1980s, deep understanding of the enemy, his weapons, and the place we would fight drove changes across the Army. This is when the Army developed Airland Battle, the Big Five, the combat training centers, and professionalized across the force with the modern volunteer Army. It also collaborated with the Air Force with the 31 initiatives to solve a problem posed by the Warsaw Pact that neither service could solve independently. Therefore, I believe that the Army and the Air Force need to look to the 1970s as a positive model and to the interwar period as a cautionary experience as we prepare for the future. And we need to get on with it because I think it's urgent. Thank you for your questions. I look forward to, or thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Deficit in innovation, if you will, in the Army had little to do with, and something to do with budget, more to do with processes, intellectual energy, within the Army. How would you characterize that today?
Well, I'm known for being candid, so I'll be candid. I think I wrote an article that came out Friday in the second part today about the importance of framing the problem you're trying to solve. And I think the National Defense Strategy actually lays out in very clear terms who it is are our contenders. And I think for the Army, quite frankly, it's Russia. Whether it's Russia in the Baltics or other armies that have Russian capabilities, even the mid-level like anti-tank guided missiles and man-pads, Russia makes the best land stuff out there among our adversaries. So I think talking about, in the article, there's a pile of concepts that are in the trash bin. Effects-based operations, network-centric warfare, air-sea battle, strategic land power, because they were never about anything other than what we wanted to do rather than what we had to do. And when circumstances changed, we moved away to something. I think multi-domain battle is suffering from the same problem. I think it can be really useful if we start saying who are we going to fight, what do they have, and where are we going to fight. And I think that's becoming more clear, particularly in the latest strategy. I hope that answered your question. So, I just refer back to what I said. So the Germans, everybody thinks the German army began in 1933 with the ascension of Adolf Hitler. It began in 1918 after the war when General von Sieg kept the best officers in the army and put them to studying how do I solve the problem of the Schlieffen Plan where people can't walk to Paris fast enough to keep this thing from collapsing on us. And it became mechanization. How do I support mechanization when artillery is horse-drawn and can't keep up? Well, that would be aviation. How do I link them? That would be radios. Every army in the world knew these things, and only the Germans put them together because they're the only ones that had a strategic problem they had to solve. Knock off France before you turn east. And there was, I show my students at Georgetown what pictures of in Germany at this time. People are burning money because coal is more expensive than money. I have a $3 billion Reichsmark note. The value of the mark went from 3 to 1 per dollar to like 3 trillion marks to the dollar. So this was, and this is before the rise of fascism and everything else. The Navy did it with carrier aviation. The Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps was no better funded than the Army was. So it's, what is the problem you're trying to solve with innovation? And I think sometimes we confuse innovation with invention, where we want to build something new instead of figuring out what do I put together in new combinations to in fact solve the problems I have. And some of that might result in a demand for invention, but we always want to go to the bright, shiny object, I think, instead of what do I need to do to solve the problem. Yeah.
Dave, Jim Curry, good to see you
How
again.
are you doing, Jim?
Dave, by the way, was one of my star students when I was teaching at NDU years ago, and it's the first time we've seen each other in a long time. You make a really compelling case that branch parochialism and service parochialism really hindered us getting into World War II. Do you think the senior service colleges today do a good job of helping overcome that for those officers who are going to be leading the various services at the general and flag officer level?
So my view is that we don't have the war colleges anymore, we have dime colleges. And I think we've lost our way in helping. There's a strategic perspective that officers have to understand, but I think we've lost the understanding of high-level command and what it means for military formations to operate. I mean, when I was at the War College, we spent more time on, I was in the industrial college, now the Eisenhower College. But I don't remember ever talking about campaigning or fighting. The National War College was talking about joint operations, but it was not giving people the professional grounding in the use of arms in winning wars. And that's my perception. I've talked at the Army War College a number of times, and I used to tell them, and this is really flip, but when you take the M out of dime, what do you have? Die. So we ought to be thinking about what the M has to do to make sure the whole piece works. And I just don't see enough of that, quite frankly, in my view. Yeah, how you doing, Sergeant Major?
So you talked about the M26 not getting into the fight till the very end. I had a chance to go through the tank museum in
Right.
Arlington a bunch of times. And, the curator there, because we gave the British a lot of tanks, M4s. And, of course, the British referred to the M4 as the Ronson.
Right.
Because it lived first time every time. And for those that saw the movie, Fury, and that's where the tank Fury is at.
Right.
But, it just kind of puzzles me that Marshall didn't realize the challenges that we had with the M4 until the Battle of the Bulge.
Right.
Why do you think it took so long for that to come to light and then to get the M26 into the fight?
So I talk about this in the book. So I think what I think is interesting about this is you have two pieces of the same institution that develop very differently. One is kind of ambivalent about technology and harnesses the technology of the present. The other takes the technology in a future direction, but loses all sight of all the assumptions they've baked into it. So over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the Army Air Forces had about 350 aircraft in England at the time, and they lose 100 and something in a 10-day period. This is a crisis. If they don't solve this, the entire concept of strategic bombing is going to vanish. This is the story of 12 o'clock high and command decision. So this is like the entire institution will vanish. And, so Hap Arnold's, figured out how to do drop tanks in a few weeks, got them fielded, P-47s were, because they finally recognized they needed it. In the case of Eisenhower, I think it's interesting because tanks are not causing a crisis. So the crisis for Eisenhower is, taking over from Friedendahl, getting ready to do the Normandy invasion, bumping into the Bocage, hitting the Hindenburg Line, the Battle of the Bulge. So, there's a lot going on in his front office. And it just isn't visible, and, all of a sudden it is. And when he's confronted with the information, he does something about it. But I think, the crisis it caused for the Army was nowhere near what the crisis of losing half your bombers in 10 days cost for the Air Force. Yeah.
Dave, You were talking about Eisenhower claiming at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, he didn't know that our tanks were inferior at that point, which I find kind of hard to believe in the sense that you had all these, I mean, at Kasserine Pass, we certainly knew our tanks were inferior then. Bradley went out and Pete Haynes went out and talked to sergeants who said, oh, the bullets just go in one side and rattle around the other. Did they think that maybe with the new 75 millimeters, the enhanced 75 millimeters on the Shermans, that solved the problem? Or were they just somehow not paying attention? Or when Patton is saying we've got the best tank, is he just blowing smoke to keep up the morale of the troops who actually have to fight and die with those tanks?
Yeah, so in the Wars I Knew It, General Harkins was the author after the fact, and essentially says he was absolutely doing it to boost morale because he knew there wasn't any, these guys are going to be fighting with this tank regardless. In North Africa, Tiger 1s were found. I found a letter from General Devers back to the War Department, to General McNair, saying that, that there's something going on here. The M3 we gave to the British and the M4, they like it because it has a high explosive round. The problem the British faced in North Africa was frequently 88 millimeter anti-aircraft guns used as anti-tank guns, and all they had was solid shot. So you'd have to essentially hit every crew member to take the crew out, and they loved the fact that we had an HE round. So anyway, Devers sends this letter and says, I think we have a problem, because he was chief of the Armored Force at the time, and said, in the note that I found, the memorandum for record from McNair, is I just talked to the Secretary of War, and we'll get him back on the reservation essentially, because we know the answer to this is the tank destroyer. So I don't think the technology at Kasserine Pass was the obvious problem. It was we bumped up against somebody that was prepared, trained, had been operating for a number of years. And again, in the kind of the macro sense of how bad everything was, the tank was not even, was not a big deal at that time. And McNair, quite frankly, believed that the tank destroyer was the solution to German armor. Unfortunately, it was designed for something the Germans never did again after Russia, which is the Blitzkrieg. They tried a breakout in the Ardennes, but we weren't bumping up against massed armored formations. Battle of Pfullendorf, one of the worst fights, where one of these division commanders had people make testimonials. There's a report out there that, if you can never get it from military history, it's called the White Report. So Eisenhower asked, and see, I think this is just a bunch of sergeants grousing, which they're prone to do. And he said, just tell me what it's really like. And in 2 days, White sent a 75-page report with testimony from almost, from brigadier generals, combat command commanders down to privates. And one combat command commander said, he's a brigadier who's like putting himself in front of the headlights with the supreme Allied commander, says, I would trade, a platoon of Shermans for one Panther. So this nonsense of we do this because it enables to ship stuff to the theater, they get off the ship and they get killed. We don't have a good tank. And, so I don't think Eisenhower was really aware of it for all sorts of good reasons, like I said. But he was, if you go to Eisenhower's papers, there's a letter back to White saying, I didn't have any idea it was like this, and immediately, got off a Twix to General Marshall. Yes, Armin.
Last year I had thanks. Well, last year I had the opportunity to get down to Florida and help celebrate the 100th birthday for General Albin Erzik. And of course, General Erzik was a battalion commander and part of the drive going in to relieve the 101st in Bastille. Right. But one of the discussions we got into was talking about the M4 Sherman. And I know that in the defense of the Sherman, I mean, right, while it had limitations, from his perspective, because it was lighter, it was a very reliable tank, and it was able to go, not only with the fuel consumption, but also the reliability of it. And I was wondering maybe if you could talk that piece of it as well.
Okay. So it was reliable until it got hit. And I think the other thing, one of the things that I think is interesting, we talked about its maneuverability. It was not nearly as maneuverable off-road as German tanks because of the width of the track. It had much more ground pressure. But, I mean, I guess the question is not whether it had utility. What amazes me is, young Americans got in these things every day and went out and fought Germans with them, knowing what the odds were. We did field the 76 on 1 out of 4 Shermans. There was a special round for it that had, what was it? A precious metal. So there's on average 4 of those rounds per platoon. But I think it got the job done. The question I think for modernization innovation is, can you get the job done better? We won the war. I had someone come in the other day and say, well, we won the war with the Sherman. I said, yeah, I got that. We could have won the war with the Pershing, too, and would have lost a lot less tanks. And we could have had the Pershing a year earlier. We could have had one when we went into Normandy. But we didn't demand it. Yeah. Hey, Jeff. This is my boss when, 300 years ago.
You would have thought that the British would have done better since they had been in the war much longer and had eyeballing the Germans on the battlefield much closer than we had done. And yet they went through the 2-pounder and then finally the 6-pounder, which wasn't that much better. And it wasn't until, 44, the end of 44, they finally began using the 17-pounder. But their tanks weren't very good.
So the 17-pounder was mounted on a Sherman called the Firefly.
Yeah.
And there's a famous fight after the initial invasion of Normandy where Michael Whitman essentially destroys an entire battalion of Fireflies. It was better. And I think the telling point about the Firefly is the British offered to modify some of our tanks to the 17-pounder. And we said, we'll just get it, we're moving along. We don't have time to do that. We got to get this stuff over the shore. So, yeah.
Their own tanks, they
were terrible.
Matilda,
Challenger.
The Cromwell, the Churchill were awful.
Yeah. So, this gets to the point. I guess the other argument I always hear, Sergeant Major, is so the Germans kept adding new tanks to the inventory, which caused real parts logistical problems. Yeah, okay. So they put a 75 millimeter on the Mark IV. They filled the Tiger 1. They filled the Panther. They filled the Tiger 2. They filled the Jagd Tiger, the Jagd Panther. They kept putting stuff in the field that was better, and yet it slowed down production and it made parts harder to get. But at least you were putting parts on a broken down tank, not a destroyed tank. Yes, sir.
I like your quip about dime, but if you want to start thinking differently, you just throw dime away, please. And speaking from, looking from what diplomacy is, it's a total misunderstanding. A diplomat's got 3 tools, and 3 tools only: logic, bribes, and threats. And all his bribes and all his threats are either diplomatic or economic. So you have to restructure this thing because you can't take it apart as independent things.
Right.
And in fact, what a chief of mission would say, looking at a country team, I have my economic. There's my economic counselor, the agricultural attaché, commercial attaché. I have information. There is my public affairs officer. I have military. There's my attaché, my Euro liaison officer, my ODC chief. And what I do is take all this and mix it together to produce diplomacy. It gives an entirely different view of what kind of military you need and how it fits into the exercise of this mixture of national power. And just,
so I think
I've heard dime from at every service college, and I think it misleads you. Start thinking something new and just throw it away.
So I think the challenge the Army and the other armed forces have had is nobody else has to go. And we are an insurance policy that the nation buys depending on what the risk is. There's no excess capacity in the other agencies of the government. Everybody saw famously when Connie Rice told all the ambassadors, I'm going to start assigning you to Iraq, and one stood up and said, no, you're not. You know, you can't make me go to Iraq, and we can't. So soldiers end up filling these voids and reconstruction teams and everything else because nobody else is there. But that the principal function, I think, of an Army is to provide that insurance policy against existential threats in a war.
I would add you have to work on the diplomats, too.
Yeah, I'd love to. Okay, yes, sir.
Sir, you mentioned some of the adaptation the Army made in dealing with the challenge of superior German armor. I was just wondering, did the Army do anything with the tank rounds of the era?
Yeah, there was one that was designed for the 76 that was more effective. But I would stress that chart with Pete Quesada and Bradley and everybody else. So Quesada came up to Bradley after they were ashore and were bumping into bocage and really difficult armor threats and said, we can fix this. I got all these P-47s hanging around because they're using P-51s for bomber escort now. And I'm going to put a pilot on the lead tank of every armored company, and I'm going to give him an Air Force radio so he can talk to an Air Force airplane. And they figured this out on the ground. Ironically, or sadly, when Devers' 6th Army Group came in through the invasion of southern France and met up with Bradley's forces, his pilots couldn't talk to Quesada's airplanes and vice versa because they developed completely independent ways of doing this. So I think I'd rather have innovation happen before rounds start going off rather than rely on doing this under fire. And I think that's the key to Army modernization, frankly.